In podcast episode 119, I discussed power and rowing with Lotte Lintmeijer. That interview sparked great interest from Dr. Volker Nolte and Dr. Valery Kleshnev, two of the leading rowing biomechanists in the field. In this podcast, they sit down with me and share their thoughts on power measurement and application and how it relates to the biomechanics of the rowing stroke. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the Leo Training Podcast, a podcast focused on scientific and real-world expertise on training strategies between your ears, behind the oar handle, on the field and court, and in the strength and conditioning room. I'm your host, Joe DeLeo. I am a strength and conditioning coach, speaker, and lifelong student focused on continuous improvement. Thank you for joining me, and let's roll to today's episode. Dr. Volker Nolte and Dr. Valery Kleshnev. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me this afternoon. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Volker. Hi, Valery. So, a little background for the audience here. This afternoon, we're going to discuss power measurement in the rowing shell. So I had Dr. Nolte reach out to me several weeks back, had listened to a podcast I did and published earlier this spring on power and a new method. So what we're going to discuss is the science behind both methods and specifically discussing the traditional method of power and why that is still a valid measurement of power in the sport of rowing. So with that, I'll kind of turn it over to Volker to kick things off.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, it was very interesting to listen to this podcast, but obviously Valery and we knew about the research that was going on in the Netherlands with a young group of researchers. And they obviously published a lot of papers, and one of which was then to propose a new measurement of power in rowing, and it struck to me actually that there was almost like a divisive kind of tone, and this should not be. I think we should promote our sport and biomechanics of rowing in the same way, and there is no real new thing. The mechanics of rowing is known quite a bit, the theory, and Valery published a lot of papers there. I started with my dissertation in 1984, where I discussed the different power measurements. So this is nothing new, and I think we should actually try to explain to the rowing community how they actually best use it, and keep it in a way that it's actually doable, correct, valid, and helps them to get better.
Sounds good. Valery, do you have anything to add?
It just came to my mind that Volker said they presented new method. In fact, it's not really new. It just came to my mind that it was, if you remember, Professor Richard Smith from Sydney Uni. Yeah. He did some rowing research in 1990s and after 2000, and he published very similar articles with very similar method, and I already criticized him because in fact it's just simple mistake. It happens in science. Some things look obvious, similar like geocentric model of the universe, right? And from ancient time, people have been watching the sun is going around the earth, right? And they developed a theory that, okay, the earth is center of the universe and everything is turning around the earth. But then they try to measure it and try to meet the ends with measurements, and the ends haven't met. So they have to develop another theory, and they then decided, okay, that probably heliocentric system, sun is center of universe. But then they found it's not quite correct as well. And now what we have now. You know, the universe is huge, many stars and galaxies and everything going somewhere, and it's expanding as well. So
we have to should go back to rowing.
yeah, science became, you know, more and more complicated, sophisticated, and some older theories has to be proved incorrect and replaced by new. And yeah, but in this case, I don't think it's too serious theory. Theory just basically quite shallow analysis and some sort of mistake and incorrect model. That's what I can say.
So let's do this to kind of set the conversation off in regards to power. Let's define the variables that we need to be able to measure effectively that come into the equation for power. And then from there, we can discuss the traditional method of power, and then how that also can factor into that being used into the NK, the Orlock, to measure power and technology currently in the rowing shells. That'll give, I think, some good context to both the athlete and the coaching community.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should go from the definition of power, right? And power is force times velocity. So there is one way to measure power, is measure the force and the velocity. And this comes immediately to this, what is called the traditional power measurement in rowing. We measure the speed of the handle, and then we measure the force on the handle, and then multiply this with each other, and we get the power. This is done in various ways, and we can discuss this, but in general, it's the same. And then, of course, the other thing is, if you have a force times velocity, you can also take another definition from power, would be energy over time, right? And so that is a change in energy if you look this over time. So you would have to measure the energy, and the energy is normally measured through velocity again, right? Energy is half mass times velocity square. And if you know the mass of an object and you measure the velocity, you can obviously calculate the energy that is exchanged there, and this is obviously the power again. And this is the start of the general discussion. What the Dutch researchers do, they say, well, we have one area is, of course, the measurement on the handle, and the other one would be obviously the measurement of the velocity of the rower's mass. But then, and Valery can obviously talk more about this too, it's then a discussion, or you really have to look, if you want to measure the velocity of the rower, in which reference system are you measuring this? And there is where the major debate comes. That it's not a question, and Valery published this, I published this, Smith published this, right? That you have these two factors, right? The energy that you put on the handle, and then of course the energy you put in moving the body back and forth, right? And you know this from an ergometer, right? If you sit on the ergometer, you don't need to put the handle on. If you simply move back and forth, after a while you start sweating, right? Because it's cost energy to move your mass. And similar as in rowing, not quite as much, because now it's the boat and the rower moves relative to each other. And this is where it becomes complicated, right? Then you need to define which reference system you use. And there is, again, it becomes quite complicated. And Valery and I believe that the Dutch researchers actually make a mistake by using the incorrect reference system.
Yeah, basically, I agree with Volker. I just would like to put it in more general way. I think standard general definition of power is amount of energy transferred per unit of time, right? So this like in this way we can measure power, not only what we're talking about now is mechanical power, but also there is some electrical power or heat power or chemical power, whatever. So generally, power is amount of energy transferred per unit of time. In mechanics, it's very simple derivation. Energy is work. Work is force time displacement. And displacement per time is velocity. So power, mechanical power is force times velocity, right? But it's, and kinetic energy, exactly what Volker said, it's mv square divided by 2. But the problem is, of course, the reference system. And in the year 2000, when I was in Australia, when I start thinking about all this kinetic energy and power, I had a friends from Australian National University. They are physicists. They well recognized, not Nobel Prize winners, but very close, top physicists in the world. They're Russians. They immigrated to Australia because of their scientific merits. You know, they're really clever people. And I asked them this question: what reference system should we use? They couldn't answer because it's really complicated. When we measure power, and for example, we measure force and velocity, then velocity from what to what, from where to where, and where is action, where is, you know, reaction, and how that. Yeah. So then. In mechanics, there is a concept, what is called minimum momentum reference system. So that's some local reference system, whereas kinetic energy is lowest. And this could be starting point. But yes, the picture is quite complicated. However, our main argument that the ore is the only channel to transfer power to external environment, positive power. I mean, negative power also transferred through the drag, through the board hole. But in rowing, if we have no oars, we cannot move, right? And the only way to apply transfer power from the rower and propel the whole system is through the oar. So if we measure torque or force on the oar and angular velocity or linear velocity of the handle, that's all. That's give us power transfer through that channel. And again, I agree with Volker. Of course, a rover produces more power. Rover spend the energy to move his body segments, limbs, legs and arms, to move his body weight up and down relative to the stretcher. And it can be analyzed in more precise way and defined the total power consumption. And it's not quite clear, by the way, is it part of biomechanics or physiology? Because muscles also consume some power just to contract, and there is some internal friction in the tendons and so on. It's also mechanical power. So, but if what we do in rowing, we simply take that channel of the main channel of power transfer, the oar, and we just measure torque and angular velocity, and that's what we do with our instrumentation. And this is really reliable and accurate method of power determination, which is very practical, quite simple, reliable, and understandable. This is what we call traditional or handle power, and I think this can be taken as a reference point. And then, if someone wants to study it more accurately, what sort of, because when we talk about efficiency, we need to know the whole power and compare power output, what we're talking about, or power, which is output power, to power input, starting from metabolic power consumed by athletes from oxygen and other chemical things, and then to find efficiency and maybe improve it, we need to maybe more and more precise and accurate analysis. That's my point.
I mean, I can add through a nice story there, right, in terms of what Valery was just saying. When I did my PhD thesis, right, I also tried to define the efficiency of rowing, right? And I analyzed one rower, right, at 2 different stroke rates and 2 different boats. In those days, we measured the sliding rigger against the seat rigger, right? Sliding seat rigger. Anyways, I had something like 4 assistants, and we analyzed only 1 stroke each, right? And it took me months to completely digitize everything, analyze everything, get the forces done, get the digitizing measurements done, and then. I mean, of course, it was more complicated than with the technology, but it is extremely difficult to get a really accurate measurement, right? And it's really not practical. And as Valery said, the most important is the energy that's the rower put in the water, and this is what he does over the handle.
Right. And so that was one of the things as I was preparing for the interview today, reading through Valery's book, The Biomechanics of Rowing. You know, the rowers applying force and power at 2 points on the face of the oar handle, and then also on the foot stretcher, those 2 points. So, and that comes into play with what we're discussing right now, the traditional method of power measurement. So I guess my question is does that also factor into some of what you were talking about, Valery, in terms of like the energy dissipation, or it sounds like there was some loss in terms of maybe internal power with heat in terms of the mechanical energy?
Yeah, I think that definition, it's just pure from the rover point of view. From the rover, we take a rover's center of mass as a reference point, and then we can see that basically the rover apply power only at 2 points, at the handle and at the stretcher, and both moves in rowing. By the way, on static erg, the stretcher is fixed, so that's the difference. Mechanics on static erg, the rover produce power only in the handle, right? In the boat, both stretcher and the handle moves. So I found the ratio is about 60 to 40. 60% of the power produced at the handle, transferred through the handle, 40 through the stretcher. But this is only because the travel of the handle is much longer than the stretcher, but the force is higher in the stretcher, right? And that stretcher force, many people still think that it's negative. It stops the boat, it pushes the boat backward. In fact, it's not, because stretcher is firmly connected through the rigger, through the boat hole, and through the rigger to the pin in the center of the oar. So when you push the stretcher, you push the oar middle, and this creates pair of forces, handle and the sleeve or collar near middle of the oar, not the middle where the oar lock pushes the oar. And this creates a pair force which directly related to blade propulsive force. And basically, without stretcher force, rowing would not be possible.
So, building on that, what you two have both shared, so let's tie that into the NK M-Power oar lock, right? Which is something that's used pretty readily and widely by different athletes, different national teams to get an accurate measurement of power during a training session on the water. And that is in fact using the traditional method of power, correct? Yes.
not quite traditional, because traditional, the most accurate way is to measure handle force at the handle, or torque on the or bend. In fact, that method is not very practical, because you have to put something on the oar, and then it's difficult. So on the oar lock, it's possible to create much more compact and more practical system to measure it from oar lock. There is some difference between rowers. So one rower can pull longer. I mean, put the hand on the handle in different way. But anyway, I think it's still very reliable and still very accurate method of measurement of the force and the power. Yes. What can you say, Volker?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would say obviously the NK Empower Oar Lock is based on your idea, right? The NK was in contact with you and developed it on you, and I think it is an enormous, valuable feedback system for any rower. I mean, any rower who is quite serious about their sport can actually use this system very effectively. And I think it's actually a very accurate and very valid feedback you get there. As Valery said, there are some calculations necessary to transfer the power that you measure on the oar lock onto the handle. But this is, from a mechanical point of view, it's obviously possible. And when you have the length of the oar and you have the levers and so on, you can do this quite accurately. And I mean, it's actually a very neat system where you have everything compact in this oar lock, and it's a very ingenious way to measure the angle of the oar with these magnets, so that you create a very stable magnetic field and measure how the oar lock is going across this. So it's a very easy to use system. It is very valuable feedback. Think about, Joe, if you sit on the ergometer, you would normally do a training and you say, today I want to do a certain intensity, right? And you say, well, I take a certain speed or power, right? Which is on the ergometer simply a calculation of a recalculation of numbers, right? And then you row at this power for whatever, half an hour, whatever you do, right? If in a rowing boat, if you sit there and want to say, okay, which intensity I'm rowing today, well, you could do speed. Well, this is very difficult because you have wind, you have to steer, you have to sometimes even current and such things, right? You say, okay, I do the heart rate. Heart rate is very difficult too, because temperature has an effect, your sleep pattern has an effect, food has an effect, and so on. So you take this oar lock and say, okay, today I'm rowing with whatever number it is, 150 watts, right? And then it's independent whether you row in wind or in current. With your 150 watts, you get a very stable feedback about your intensity. And that's extremely, extremely valuable. Now, if you now start in the spring and say, okay, I can row, and again, I make numbers up, for half an hour consistently 150 watts, and then a month later you can do half an hour 160 watts, well, you improved by 10 watts, right? It's a very a good feedback system that is very, very helpful for rowers, right? And then if you then further go one step further, you compare then your wattage with the speed you're doing, you can actually see, for example, if your technique is improving, right? You're on the same stretch of water with the same wind, you row a certain wattage and say, oh, look at today, I can row one bit faster. Well, I did something better, right?
So question for both of you. So in your opinions, do you think, so if I was a master's rower, would it be better?
You are a master's rower.
I know, I am now. Yeah. But
You're a master's rower.
I know. If I was going out to train And would it be better, in your opinion, to use the NK Empower Orlock versus a speed coach? To come back to your point about independent of weather, current, heart rate, you're going to be able to get that feedback in terms of the wattage, or the output rather, the power output, versus the speed coach. There is going to be some disruption in terms of current, wind, weather. That's going to play a factor into the speed coach reading.
Well, in fact, to use Empower Lock, you still need a speed coach, because it's connected. It's connected to speed coach, and it just adds much more information. And of course, I would recommend you, to use Empower Lock, because it gives you not only power work per stroke, it gives you catch, finish angle,
slip, wash.
Yeah, sleep, wash, position of your peak force, which is really invaluable information, for rowing technique. And I think generally, Empower Lock is sort of revolution in rowing, and it gives you information in very different, aspect, not only your heart rate and board speed, but also something more about your technique. And I think in this pathway, we are following other sports. If you compare with cycling, they all use power meters now, right? And they also have speed meters, but power meter is more practical, because cyclists can go uphill, downhill, different wind, and most of them use power as a main criterion on workout. How much power, how they produce, and they try to keep the power at certain level to create some sort of intensity zones training. And this way to go. That's 21st century level of training in modern sport. And I think NK, Nielsen Kellerman, have done a tremendous, fantastic job in making this. Actually, it was just my idea, and my initial idea, I always try to, the scientist always try to make things more complicated. And I think it was great job from NK to make it very simple, very understandable for most of masters rowers as well, for most of the people how it works. And they limited. Initially, I wanted, to display many variables, but they said, no, it will be too complicated. And I think they will be right, because, too much sometimes means nothing. You have to focus on something and to make it meaningful, and explain what it means and how it related, how you can improve your technique with these numbers. And I think they done really great job in terms of that development, which I said again, it's sort of revolution in rowing training.
Yeah. Volker, did you have anything to add before I ask?
Well, you are specifically asking about you as a masters rower, right? I mean, for sure.
Sure. I'm all ears. Go ahead. Give it. I'm listening.
I mean, look at this. The masters have all the time in the world. They have all the money that's needed, right? So why would you not add this little bit instrument to your boat to get this feedback that Valery was just talking about? And you can choose, again, how much information you want, even though they could give you way more information. The measurement would offer way more opportunities, but it would be way too complicated. However, it is definitely a major up to only getting the speed, for sure.
So with that, what I'll kick back to both of you, I think is an excellent question to ask right there is, So if we were using the Empower or Lock in combination with the Speed Coach, and we're getting more data, more information than we're used to normally if I had only been training with the Speed Coach previously. If you were working with a rower, what would you tell them at the beginning to just focus on in terms of those new variables or that new data coming in to change their training program or work on their rowing stroke?
I mean, it's again, this is I think very easy. The first thing you would start with simply measuring the rowing angle, the oar angle. So this is I think this is the first measurement tool that in a very simple way gives you this feedback, right? And especially if you row in a crew boat, how did we set the foot stretcher in the longitudinal position of the boat, right? Now you have this oar lock, and you can do this extremely precisely, right? You can see the one person is long at the catch position, the other one is long at the finish position, right? And so this is the start, right? And then if the foot stretcher is set and you consistently row, you actually produce literally the same oar angle. So you can move to the next step, right? And theirs would be, for example, that you look at your slip and wash. This means how long does it take on the oar angle to reach a certain force, right? So how quick can you lock onto the water, and how long can you hold on to the water there? And this gives you a very interesting feedback, right? And then you can try out how you can improve this, obviously. And Valery provided some measurements there, some guidelines, what international rower is doing of different levels, so elite to senior B and juniors and lightweights and all this stuff. So you get some idea in which range you should actually be. And again, Valery, do you have numbers for masters too? Probably, right? So.
Oh, sorry, Volker, not much for my.
We cannot help Joe. It's unbelievable. Yeah. Anyway, so Joe, then I will send you my data, and then you can see. Anyway, so you know what I mean. You can position yourself as a master. I mean, obviously, you most likely won't reach world-class elite numbers, but maybe
sure.
You are anywhere between a novice collegiate rowing and varsity collegiate rowing, right? Something like this. And it gives you another good idea and a focus to work on, which you didn't have before. And then as Valery already said, what's used in bicycling and what I mentioned before, you learn very quickly at which power you can row for certain lengths of time. You know, how much average power you use when you row a 1,000-meter race or a long distance race, or you row for 1 hour steady state. And it gives you a good feedback. You know, today you can do this again with 150 watts. Next day you can do it with whatever, 160 watts, whatever, right? This gives you really, really good feedback. And I can tell you.
Just a second, I'll tell more something.
Yeah. If you go, for example, a little bit too fast, a little bit too high power, and the speed maybe doesn't give you this feedback, right? And 10 minutes later, you are toast, right? Because
right.
You are simply went to too high of an intensity. So with this variety that I gave you already, you can do quite a number of things quite easily in terms of feedback for individual training and specifically for masters. And you know, also masters normally always train on a too high intensity, you know that? Especially younger masters of your age, right? They think they still can do this what they did 5 years earlier, right? And again, I was joking, of course, right? Sorry for this. The feedback you get there is very valuable, again, to keep you actually in a safe area of your training and not trying to overdo. And I mean, I was guilty as this too. As long as I didn't have this oar lock, I was always trying to maintain a certain speed, right? And then if the wind was a little bit up, you know, I almost fell out of the boat 2 kilometers later because I tried to go way too fast.
Right. So do you both think that rowing will continue to evolve along a parallel that cycling has in terms of power measurement and power output will be how we base our training programs around, and perhaps less around, blood lactate levels and heart rate levels in comparison.
Absolutely. I think there is no other way to go. And rowing, as well as cycling, there's two very technical sports. We have quite sophisticated equipment, and many points where the athlete interacts with equipment, and that's the points where force and power can be measured. Similar in rowing and cycling, differently from swimming or something like from running. I think it's more complicated in those sports. But even in those sports, they try to do something and to evaluate somehow the power. And of course, we live now in information age, information revolution, and information dictates everything. And people who own the information, they own the world.
That's right. That's Google right there.
But there's an interesting twist in this. You may not really be aware of this, right? This measurement would be not allowed in international rowing, right? The FISA rules specifically disallow any measurement of power in the boat. So you would not be allowed to row with the Nielsen Kellerman oarlock in an international FISA sanctioned race. And this is actually a problem, because the technical committee from FISA, who is responsible for these rules, right, is very, very traditional, right? And by the way, there's an American gentleman involved in this. You probably noticed, Joe, right? Who is very, very against further technology. On the other hand, you think about if, let's say, you watch an Olympic race, Ollie Seidler against this Danish guy, I forgot the name, of course, right? And you see the last, you think about, you would get to the rowers, you would get this little bubble there and say, okay, Ollie Seidler rows with 600 watts and Nielsen rows with 550 watts. So Nielsen has something left. And you know what I mean?
There's a gamification element to it.
Yeah, I mean, I saw some bicycling races where they did this, right? So they did some sprint racing after an 8-hour race there, right? At the last couple hundred meters, and you could see the one guy was literally holding back, and then all of a sudden, the power jumped, and you knew it's coming, right? So he would then come, and it was really exciting, right? And so again, I agree with Valery. This is invaluable, and it's definitely coming, right? And it's interesting how international rowing is actually falling behind there. Now, the good news is in America, Canada, and England and Russia, you are allowed to do this nationally.
Yes, only a few FISA races are not allowed, and I think it's quite questionable position, and I hope it will be discussed, in the future and maybe changed, because obviously that's. I think the main reason was not to make rowing cheaper, and affordable, for some poor nations who have no money, to buy all that equipment. But there's a few counter arguments against that position, because in fact, if you compare the cost of the Empower oarlock with cost of the boat and oars, and basically it's similar to the oars, but much cheaper than the boat, And
Valery, you used the same arguments that I used in 1983 when FISA disallowed the sliding rigger.
Yes.
It did not change. FISA is still 40 years back.
Yes.
Wow. The interesting point that you both brought up in regards to power and if that was kind of on screen, it makes me think of if you're watching an American football game and they have an athlete, sprinting, they'll actually have like a little pop out, like a call out on the screen, and it'll show how many like miles per hour they're running.
Yeah.
So essentially it's very similar. It's a different variable. You're talking about watts versus, miles per hour, but the idea, the concept is still very much the same, where you're adding this video game or gamification element, which in a lot of ways I think would be fantastic for the sport of rowing, because then all of a sudden, if you were to broadcast that on television or over the internet for races, it makes it much more interactive. There's more experience to the race.
Yeah. Think about, let's say you watched an AIDS race, right? So what last year, what they had in there is this long distance race in Germany. Remember where the German rower collapsed and then the Dutch rower collapsed, right? So you have the measurements of each one rower's power, and then you see that whatever 3 seed, he's losing power. Something is going wrong. What's going wrong? Did the Dutch guys realize? In the Dutch 8 now, 4 seed is. Think about it.
I could see a future in broadcasting here. That'd be great.
Here we go.
That's good. That's good.
Hopefully someone is watching us.
No, that's a great point. I mean, because I've listened to another podcast, the Row Show, with 2 South African rowers, and one of the questions they always ask at the end of the interview with the guests is if you could race another distance at a FISA regatta, like what would it be, or what do we need to do to continue to evolve the sport? And almost across the board, it's we need to do something like 250 meters or 500 meters. It needs to be there needs to be a sprint, contest, to see who can get to the line the fastest, just all out. So anyway, that popped into my head there. Well, gentlemen, do you guys have anything else to add in terms of the discussion around either the Empower or Lock, or in terms of the application of power to training, or the method of measurement, any of those things that we've touched on this afternoon?
I think we can fill another 10 podcasts, so don't worry, we know things. But I mean, you should ask us in terms of, let's say, from your position, if you would put yourself in a position as an athlete or a coach, what would you like to hear?
Well, I try to make coaching decisions around being as informed as possible, and taking into context the fact that, at the end of the day, regardless of the sport, when we're working with athletes, we're managing a lot of stress that they're going through, whether that's physical, emotional, mental, social. So the more information, the more data, accurate data that I can get, that's going to inform me of their ability or their readiness to train, is going to allow me to, if I need to, change the training program or adapt the training program so the athletes are in the best position to continue to make progress. So those are the things, I think, the concepts, broader strokes that I kind of care about. So for example, if we were in a strength and conditioning environment, doing more with velocity-based training, where instead of just moving load in terms of sets, reps, or total kilograms moved, now we're looking actually at the speed of the bar. And so if the athlete comes in and they've been training with that, and there's ranges for different lifts on kind of standards of what's a good speed or a training speed for a characteristic of strength. So if that athlete comes in and say they're moving the bar at 0.7 meters a second for a lift, and then they come in this day and they're down to like 0.3 meters a second, well, that's a huge drop off So we know that something's going on. Maybe they're sick, maybe they didn't sleep well, but there's no point in them training at that load on the bar. So we're going to either have them do a different session or go much, much lighter and try to get the speed of the bar moving that fast. So those are some of the things. So to answer your question, I would want the most accurate data that I can to make the most informed decisions.
And I think that you will see probably also some research coming in terms of, we don't really know too much about how fast a rower should move the handle or whatever, right? I mean, this could be easily measured. This would be simply a calculation from the data that you get, for example, with Empower Orlock, right? Would be interesting to see, but it would be obviously different, a different feedback, because in rowing, you don't want to get maximum speed. You want to have, let's say, a power application or a force application over a long time. But again, velocity comes into play. So this would be something to look into. And I'm not sure, Valery, you know about some research in this area?
Yeah, I think velocity, of course, it's one of components of the power. And if you remember, recently I developed sort of handle drag factor idea and mass equivalent. It also shows how heavy rowing feels, because ratio of force and velocity also shows. Yeah, I think velocity is really important, and it has implications on the power and depend on many other variables, like rigging, and for example, and is it too heavy rigging, or where is the optimal rigging, synchronization in the crew, stroke length. Yeah, it's rowing is not as simple as it looks like, when you start analyzing it.
I actually do have a couple questions for both of you that I was thinking of, since I have both of you on. So one of the questions I've been kind of rolling around in my head for the last few months is, has anyone ever measured the drive speed, like, so from the moment the blade enters the water until the release in all the different boat classes? So both men and women, from the single to the 8, and looking at how fast they're moving through the water, the drive time?
Yes, of course. I have all the statistical data, yeah. Average nose handle velocity.
So if we had that information, so then my next question would be, is a way of identifying talent in the sport is, we have a 10-second watts test, a minute test, 2K, 6K, and then some type of endurance test, 30 or 60 minutes. So you have all those numbers, but what if you started to look at, so you had 2 athletes and they both express power at the same output level, let's just say, around 1,000 watts. But what if they were able to go through the drive from catch to release much faster? Would it be a potential way of saying maybe this athlete's better suited to being in the 8 because they can move much quicker from catch to release? And then this athlete, they can express the same total wattage, but they're a little bit slower. Maybe we should put them in a boat that's maybe a little quote unquote heavy, or something like a single or a double. That was just a theory that I've kind of been rattling around in my head. What do you think about that?
I would do it on the ERC, for example. Maybe I would develop some sort of tests for the ERC. But on water, it's many, as I said, many other variables, which is, for example, depth of the blade, rigging again, which affects the speed of the handle, and rowing style, for example, and stroke length, weather conditions. So it's I think it's quite difficult to do on water. So I would say on the ERC probably, yeah, that could be sort of test.
Well, actually, from my perspective, rowing is more complicated than that, right?
It is, but
because there is some theory. For example, in an 8, right? You don't want to have 8 people of the same qualities that you just described. right? So you want to have maybe on stroke, you want to have someone who is very quick, right? Where in the middle of the boat, you want to have someone who is really able to move big loads, right? I mean, this comes into play too, right? With whom you are rowing, right? Not only the boat class. So there is, I believe, not such a simple answer to your question.
No, I don't think it's simple. And I guess the other thing to include was I wasn't necessarily thinking in terms of trying to do it on an erg or in a boat. What I was actually thinking of is there potential to try to train those types of qualities in a gym setting, right? Where we can work a lot on strength or power development, but also the ability to kind of bring the athlete's nervous system along. So in other sports like track and field, for example, you have an overspeed training effect. And so for example, say an athlete's working on maybe their 40-yard dash or a sprint time. They can't yet run, a tenth of a second faster. So that athlete will be assisted or pulled along just a little bit faster than they're currently able of going. So my thought is could we take that principle and start to try to find ways in the gym to help bring along rowers in terms of development and get them moving so they're becoming more powerful?
I mean, again, there are certainly possibilities. And I mean, again, Valery said, I mean, you can set on the ergometer, right? You can let them row on when setting 0, right? Then you get this overspeed kind of work, right? In order to get a high wattage, they have to do way, way faster than they normally would do, right? I mean, from a training theory aspect, I would think you have to train in rowing both. Right. I mean, this is why
100%.
you have some cans, carry cans on the boat, right? And then on the other hand, you could row either with very, very short oars to get high stroke rates, right? Or what people sometimes do as a single rower, they row in an 8 to get the feeling of speed.
Right. And so one of the things you just touched on there is they have to do both. So if they had cans, they'd be working on really building or training the ability to build, higher force, but the speed's not as fast. And then they're doing something else where they're learning to physically move a little bit quicker and have that velocity component. So you have kind of one that's more neural or nervous system focused. That makes sense. So that's a great example. And I think the other question that I had to ask you both, since I have you both on, is when I was looking through your book, Valery, there's a section of the book that talks about the different rowing styles, DDR, Rosenberg, Adam, and Grinko, and then kind of lists some of the pros and cons of each, and then also had some of the graphs with the higher power outputs. So one of the questions I had for you both was, how does that relate to, how does the different styles of power output or rowing technique relate to the athlete's posture and then potentially injury mechanisms of the low back?
Difficult to say. It's a good question, actually. Yeah, and I was asked already, people, asking similar questions. My point is injuries happens. Of course, the good posture is absolutely compulsory. The strong position of low back straight. That's absolutely necessary to prevent injuries. But I think the injuries mainly happens when force suddenly increases, and very quick increase of the change of the force. And I think from my understanding, that's the main mechanism of injuries, some sort of rupture. jerking force. Yeah, and so that's why I think difficult to say, difficult to relate it to rowing style, and also, you know, that classification of rowing styles, it's not my invention. It's basically proposed by Peter Cleverer, something like 1979, 40 years ago, and it was. And everything changes, you know. In 40 years, we don't have GDR anymore now. We don't have Soviet Union, and different countries, different, of course. And rowing changed a lot. So I think now there's some sort of, we can find different rowing style, another combination of them, mixture. So I don't have clear answer to this question. I just want to emphasize what I mentioned. Good posture is really important, and of course, try to find the proper gearing, not too heavy, and stiffness of the oar. I think it's important. Too stiff oar creates really sharp force gradient, I think, and softer oar may help, you know. So that's why the oar stiffness must be appropriate for the rower. Heavyweight man probably may use stiffer oars. Lightweight woman may need softer oars. That's my point. Yeah.
I mean, the interesting point there with injuries is actually, I actually asked a few people who work in injury and injury prevention in rowing, is we have very little data about this, real data, right? So for example, at which part of the stroke is actually injury happen most of the time, right? So for example, there is no data for some reason available where say, okay, whatever, 80% happens at whatever, the first part of the drive or wherever it is, right? I mean, almost you have to go from anecdotal data from someone who tells you, right? I mean, additionally to your theory here, Valery, where you say injury happens through a sudden impact of a force, I think also injury happens through if a system lets loose for some reason, right? And again, this is anecdotal information. So for myself, I'm a little bit wonky with my back. I mean, I'm rowing since whatever 60 years, so it's nothing else to expect, right? I seem to get injured if I get exposed to some kind of situation where, for example, the boat moves, right, at a point where I don't expect it, right? You know what I mean? So I can row most of my time in a single and have no problem, right? And then I row with some people that I'm not 100% know, right? And then plus all of a sudden there is some kind of movement coming that I cannot foresee for some reason. And this draws me off, right? And again, this is probably also not only that something gets loose, but also an extra force coming in, right? So I believe rowing has to do a much better job in really going after this in terms of identifying where it's happened. So we have obviously some consensus, like what you call posture. I call always important is to be stable, right? The back curvature is, I think it's not as important, right? Important is that it's stable, so that you have a good core, and this is also good a matter of technique, right? That you engage the legs properly and such things. And then of course, balance is a major problem, right? Because in the second the boat is unbalanced, what you do, your body does from a reflex, let loose, right? So some party lets loose, and in the same time you push on the foot stretcher. This all of a sudden increases the force, for example, in the back. And okay, this is now theory. It is not. There is no hard research behind, right?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Volker, and I think yes, synchronization is in a crew really important for injury prevention. And I agree that we have not enough data about, not enough research. I just can tell you a quite funny case. When I was in Australia, I assisted one guy to measure force on ergometer who blew a strain gauge on his rib with surgery. Can you imagine that?
I know, I heard about
Oh,
that.
wow.
I heard
Yeah,
about
heard of,
someone put a accelerometer on his hip, on the hip bone.
yes, yes. Yeah, so this is sort of extremity, but I'm not sure what was outcomes of that research. And the most of the articles about rowing injuries, which I read, they basically compare static ergs with mobile ergs or something like different workloads, but they say nothing about real structure of the movement. What we call posture, or Volker call it looseness of the body, but I think it's very similar things. Good posture, you have stable, strong position of your, spine, your trunk, and all muscles are ready and relaxed at right time and ready to work at right time. And that's what we. And there's basically no research in this sort of in this area. Yeah.
Would it be very difficult to be able to have instrumentation or measurement in place to actually capture if there was a change in like spinal kinematic position in the boat, like so that you could actually, like you're talking about, so there was starting to try to see some data of when
There is
that,
some research already out there, right? I mean, about this fatigue is there are some measurements out there where they and I remember it was actually done here in London at
In
University
Imperial
West.
College, yes.
Well, no,
Alice
no, also at Western here in London, Ontario. I mean, McGregor does research in Imperial College and here too. So this is known, Joe, that let's say if you sit for 1 hour on the ergometer, your posture deteriorates.
yeah, that I was aware of in terms of, they've kind of identified like a break point at 30 minutes. Like, so if you're going to do a longer endurance session, they recommend that, to break it up, don't go longer than 30 minutes, because that's when you start to see a change in spinal position. And then there was a spike or an increase in low back injuries after that 30-minute mark.
No, careful. There is. I think there is no data about this, right? This is again. They found after 30 minutes there was more movement, right? So, or the curvature of the back increased, right? It is very hard. I mean, Joe, think about, you do a research and say, okay, Joe, I will test you and would like to put you under conditions where we actually expect that you get injured, right? This would be the thing. Then we could measure it, right? But you would not be allowed to do this kind of thing because your university would not agree to
Sign off on it.
From an ethical point of view, right? You cannot do it. And it is quite often that we don't have measurement on someone when an injury happens, right? So what I think is actually so basic information that it would be more so identified. So Joe comes to a doctor, says, I had an accident today, I hurt my back. And then they say, okay, can you remember at which minute it was? Can you remember under which load it was? Can you remember the water conditions? Can you remember with whom you rode? Can you remember at which part of the stroke did this happen? You know what I mean? Such very systematic data that could help us. If you then take thousands of such cases, say, look at this. There is a high probability if A, B, and C comes together, then you get injured. And this is not there, right? This is all anecdotal. It's all, so the 30 minutes on the ergometer, this is one of these things. Well, yeah, be careful. This is, but why not 29 and a half minutes or 30 and a half minutes? You know what I mean? Or
I just recall reading that in a
well,
research.
this is how they set it up. right? This is how they set up the research, right? But then they say, okay, so at around 30 minutes, then people get more loose in their back around. Well, this is with these 10 people that they measured, right? You know what I mean? Valery, for example, the rower Valery probably react completely different than the rower Joe, right? So there is something with fatigue, of course, right?
Right, but you're saying it's not a hard and fast rule. It's not going to apply.
I don't think so. I mean,
yeah.
You know what this is? I love rowing long pieces.
Yeah, so do I. It's enjoyable. You get into a rhythm and you can kind of just...
Yeah. So why should I stop at 30 minutes? So
Very good.
But I'm joking, right? I mean, everyone does this on their own or at the best results, right? So, I mean, I would then like to know, is there a physiological benefit to do a break, right? Or is there a physiological benefit not to do a break? You know, that you have to, this kind of information too. It is, again, if you really look into it, it's very complicated and it's not so easy, right? Which is, on the other hand, I think it's nice. Otherwise, research would be done and Valery and Ivy could go in retirement.
Well, those are kind of the two big questions I have for you. Thank you for offering your insight and wisdom on those two questions. Appreciate it. And as well as sitting down with me this afternoon and sharing all of your experience here from the last several decades of your work in the sport. Thank you for listening to the Leo Training Podcast. If this content is important to you, please be sure to rate and review so more people can listen. Also, you may follow me on social media, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook to get weekly free content. For more in-depth content, please subscribe to my email newsletter at my website, leotraining.io. Be sure to check out the resources page to download free, helpful content. If you have any questions or feedback, please contact me directly by email at joe@leotraining.io or via Instagram. The handle is @leotraining. Thank you again for listening and have a great day.